They thought they were throwing out an ordinary woman, but within 2 hours they would realize they had turned away the one guest who could change the future of their entire resort. The first sound anyone noticed was not the deep horn of the approaching yacht but the sudden silence that swept across the private marina as employees stopped what they were doing and turned toward the glittering horizon. Guests stepped onto balconies, cameras slowly lifted into the air, and conversations faded into whispers as an enormous white yacht cut gracefully across the turquoise water like something from another world. Every member of the resort's executive staff rushed toward the waterfront, convinced one of the world's wealthiest investors had finally arrived. None of them dared imagine that the woman they had forced to leave only 2 hours earlier was the very person waiting to welcome its owner. 2 hours earlier, Claire Bennett walked along the stone pathway leading to Seabrook Cove Resort with the relaxed pace of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. At 38, she carried herself with quiet confidence instead of flashy elegance. Her blonde hair rested loosely over a simple white linen shirt, faded blue jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a canvas tote that looked more suited for a local farmer's market than one of Florida's most exclusive oceanfront resorts. She wore no designer logos, no sparkling jewelry beyond a modest wedding band, and no expensive handbag announcing status before she spoke. That had always been Claire's way. She believed kindness should introduce a person long before wealth ever could. Warm ocean air drifted across the entrance as towering palm trees swayed gently beneath the bright morning sun. Crystal fountains shimmered beside polished marble walkways while luxury SUVs lined the circular driveway. Bell attendants hurried to greet arriving guests dressed in tailored suits and flowing resort fashion. Claire paused for a moment, taking in the peaceful view of the Atlantic Ocean stretching beyond the infinity pools. She smiled softly, imagining Ethan's face when he discovered the anniversary surprise she had spent weeks arranging. Their 10th anniversary deserved something unforgettable, and arriving a few hours ahead of him would give her enough time to prepare everything without ruining the surprise. She quietly checked the time on her phone before slipping it back into her tote. Everything was perfectly on schedule. As she stepped through the grand entrance beneath towering glass doors, conversations slowed almost imperceptibly. Several guests glanced toward her before returning to their champagne and business discussions. A concierge standing behind the polished reception desk noticed her immediately, his practiced smile hesitating for only a fraction of a second before becoming carefully measured. Claire barely noticed. She simply admired the sunlight pouring through massive windows, illuminating elegant chandeliers and fresh white orchids arranged throughout the lobby. Somewhere beyond the reception area, a pianist played a gentle melody that floated through the marble hall. Claire breathed in slowly, grateful for the calm. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, nearly everyone inside that magnificent resort would judge her without knowing a single thing about the woman standing quietly before them, and that decision would soon become the most expensive mistake they had ever made. Victoria Hayes had spent 15 years building her reputation as the general manager of Seabrook Cove Resort, and she believed she could measure a guest's value within seconds of seeing them. Standing behind the reception desk in her perfectly tailored navy suit, she watched Claire Bennett approach with the calm confidence of someone who clearly did not realize she had wandered into one of the most exclusive destinations on the Florida coast. Victoria noticed the canvas tote, the inexpensive sneakers, and the absence of luxury accessories. In her mind, the conclusion had already been reached before a single word was exchanged. "Good morning," Claire said with a warm smile. "I am meeting someone later today, but I arrived early. I would also like to speak with whoever is coordinating private events." Victoria offered a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Certainly. May I have your reservation confirmation?" Claire opened her phone and searched through her email. "Actually, my husband handled the reservation. I only know he wanted today to be special, so I came ahead of schedule." Victoria folded her hands neatly. "Without a reservation number, I am afraid I cannot verify anything." Claire nodded politely. "I understand. Perhaps I could wait in the lounge while I contact him." The request seemed perfectly reasonable, yet Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced towards several elegantly dressed guests enjoying coffee beneath the towering windows. The image Claire presented simply did not fit the atmosphere Victoria believed the resort should project. "Our guest lounge is reserved exclusively for registered visitors," Victoria replied. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of the public cafes down the road." Claire blinked, surprised more by the tone than the words themselves. "I only need a few minutes. My husband is traveling this morning, and I do not want to interrupt an important meeting unless I absolutely have to." Before Victoria could answer, Ryan Cole, the head concierge, approached with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. Is there anything I can help with?" Claire thanked him and briefly explained her situation. Ryan listened carefully, sensing nothing unusual beyond a traveler arriving ahead of schedule. "We can probably sort this out," he began, but Victoria interrupted before he finished. "Ryan, I will handle this." Her voice remained controlled, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Nearby conversations slowed as curious guests glanced toward the reception desk. Victoria lowered her voice only slightly. "Seabrook Cove maintains certain standards. We cannot simply allow anyone to occupy our private spaces without proper verification." Claire remained composed. "I appreciate your responsibility. I truly do. I simply hoped to wait quietly until my husband arrived." Victoria's smile became thinner. "Ma'am, I believe that would be best accomplished somewhere else." Claire looked around the breathtaking lobby one more time, taking in the sunlight reflecting across the marble floors and the peaceful sound of the piano still drifting through the air. She had imagined this morning very differently. Even so, she refused to let disappointment replace dignity. She simply thanked them for their time, adjusted the strap of her canvas tote, and walked calmly toward the entrance, never noticing the dock supervisor outside who caught sight of her from a distance and frowned with quiet recognition. Claire stepped outside without looking back, allowing the enormous glass doors to close quietly behind her. The cool air conditioning disappeared, replaced by the warm ocean breeze carrying the scent of saltwater and blooming hibiscus. She stood still for a brief moment, letting the disappointment settle without allowing it to become anger. Over the years she had learned that dignity did not disappear simply because someone else refused to recognize it. She adjusted the strap of her canvas tote and walked toward the marina that stretched beyond the resort's private beach. Behind the reception desk, Victoria Hayes watched through the towering windows until Claire disappeared from sight. Satisfied that the situation had been resolved, she turned back toward her staff. "We cannot afford confusion," she said confidently. "People expect exclusivity when they stay here. Our reputation depends on maintaining standards." Several employees nodded automatically, although Ryan Cole remained unusually quiet. Something about the exchange continued to trouble him. Claire had not argued, demanded special treatment, or raised her voice. She had simply asked to wait. The memory lingered in his mind as he returned to greeting arriving guests. Meanwhile, Claire found an empty wooden bench overlooking Dock 7. Luxury yachts gently rocked against polished pilings while seabirds circled overhead beneath the brilliant blue sky. Families laughed aboard sightseeing boats, and a light breeze rippled across the calm water. She removed her phone from her tote and looked at the time again. Ethan's meeting should have ended by now, but she knew how unpredictable his schedule could become whenever international investors were involved. Rather than interrupt him with unnecessary details, she typed a short message instead. "I am waiting at Dock 7. Take your time. Everything is fine." She smiled softly after pressing send, although the words were only partly true. Across the marina, an older dock supervisor named Samuel Brooks happened to glance toward the bench. His weathered face showed a flicker of recognition. He was certain he had seen Claire before, although not inside the resort. It had been months earlier aboard a magnificent white yacht during a charity event supporting coastal conservation. He remembered how every crew member had greeted her with genuine affection rather than forced politeness. Samuel narrowed his eyes thoughtfully but decided not to approach. Surely it had to be someone else. A woman dressed so simply could not possibly be connected to one of the most recognizable yachts on the East Coast. Back inside the resort, preparations intensified for the arrival of an anonymous billionaire whose identity had been kept confidential. Floral arrangements were inspected for the third time. Executive chefs revised tasting menus. Housekeeping polished every visible surface until the marble reflected the chandeliers like still water. Victoria personally reviewed the welcome protocol, reminding everyone that first impressions determined future partnerships. "This guest could invest tens of millions of dollars," she declared. "There will be no mistakes today." As those words echoed through the lobby, Ryan quietly looked toward the entrance where Claire had stood less than 30 minutes earlier. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Sometimes the greatest mistakes did not announce themselves with alarms or raised voices. Sometimes they walked calmly through the front door, smiled politely, thanked everyone for their time, and left without anyone realizing exactly what had just slipped away. Minutes passed peacefully along the marina as Claire watched sunlight dance across the water, completely unaware that every decision unfolding inside the resort was slowly moving toward an irreversible consequence. She was not worried about Ethan. After 10 years of marriage, she understood his world better than anyone. Unexpected meetings, delayed arrivals, and confidential calls had become ordinary parts of life, but one promise had never changed. No matter how demanding business became, he never failed to keep his word to her. Claire looked down at her simple wedding band and smiled gently, remembering the day they had agreed that success would never determine how they treated people. They had built their life on that principle long before extraordinary wealth had entered the picture. A vibration interrupted her thoughts. Ethan had replied with only a few words. "Landing soon. Dock 7. See you shortly." Claire slipped the phone back into her tote without feeling the slightest need to explain what had happened inside the resort. She preferred celebrating their anniversary over discussing an unpleasant encounter that would likely never matter again. A few yards away, Samuel Brooks continued organizing docking assignments while stealing occasional glances toward Claire. The memory finally became clear. During the environmental fundraiser 6 months earlier, she had personally thanked every member of the yacht crew before leaving. She had spoken with the captain, the deckhands, and even the kitchen staff with the same warmth she had shown the event organizers. Samuel remembered thinking that genuinely kind people were remarkably rare among the wealthy. Still, he questioned his own memory. If she truly belonged aboard that extraordinary vessel, why would she be sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench carrying an inexpensive canvas bag? Meanwhile, activity inside Seabrook Cove Resort reached a new level of intensity. Victoria Hayes gathered department heads inside the executive conference room overlooking the marina. Elegant digital renderings of future resort expansions filled the large presentation screen while architectural models occupied the polished oak table. "Everything depends on today's visit," Victoria reminded them. "If the investment group approves this property, we are looking at a renovation exceeding $200 million. Every detail matters." Heads nodded around the room. The atmosphere carried equal parts excitement and pressure. Ryan Cole listened quietly, but his attention drifted toward the panoramic windows facing the water. Something outside caught his eye for only a moment before disappearing beyond the horizon. It looked like the distant outline of an unusually large yacht approaching from open water. Back at the marina, harbor employees began checking radio communications with unusual urgency. Dock attendants adjusted mooring lines while security staff quietly repositioned themselves along the waterfront. Tourists noticed the sudden increase in activity and wondered aloud whether a celebrity might be arriving. Claire remained seated, enjoying the peaceful breeze without realizing that every pair of binoculars in the harbor was now focused on the same distant point. The vessel slowly grew larger against the shimmering blue horizon, its brilliant white hull reflecting sunlight like polished marble. Even from miles away, experienced sailors recognized that it belonged to a completely different class of luxury than the yachts normally visiting the coastline. Samuel looked from the approaching vessel back to Claire, then toward the resort towering behind them. A quiet realization began settling into his mind. Sometimes the biggest stories did not begin with grand entrances or dramatic announcements. Sometimes they began with one simple misunderstanding that revealed far more about character than wealth ever could. The distant silhouette continued growing until every person along the waterfront understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Conversations faded into stunned whispers as the massive yacht glided effortlessly across the calm Atlantic, its polished white hull reflecting the afternoon sun like liquid silver. The vessel towered above every other boat in the marina, stretching well over 300 feet from bow to stern. Crew members dressed in crisp Navy uniforms stood perfectly aligned along the decks while the American flag fluttered gently above the bridge. Cameras appeared almost instantly as tourists hurried toward the seawall, eager to capture a glimpse of the spectacular arrival. Samuel Brooks lowered his clipboard and quietly shook his head. During more than 20 years managing private docks, he had seen celebrities, athletes, and business leaders arrive aboard remarkable yachts, but this vessel belonged to an entirely different league. Nearby harbor workers exchanged knowing looks. There was only one yacht matching those unmistakable lines, and it belonged to Bennett Global Holdings. Inside Seabrook Cove Resort, excitement exploded through every department. A front desk associate rushed into the executive office. "The yacht is almost here," she announced breathlessly. Victoria Hayes smiled with visible satisfaction. "Excellent. Everyone to your positions." Employees straightened jackets, adjusted name tags, and hurried toward the marina entrance. Fresh champagne was prepared. Photographers positioned themselves discreetly behind decorative palms. Victoria rehearsed her welcoming smile one final time before leading her executive team outside. Ryan Cole followed close behind, although his attention remained fixed on the wooden bench near Dock 7. Claire was still sitting peacefully, watching the approaching yacht with a soft expression that looked almost familiar rather than impressed. She never reached for her phone again. She never hurried forward. She simply waited with remarkable patience. Ryan frowned. Most people would have been recording the moment or asking questions. Claire merely stood when the yacht finally slowed beside the dock. Powerful engines became almost silent as experienced crew members secured thick mooring lines with practiced precision. The entire marina seemed to pause. Even seabirds circling overhead drifted quietly across the blue sky as if unwilling to interrupt the moment. Victoria stepped confidently toward the end of the dock with her executive staff lined neatly behind her. She believed the billionaire investor would emerge any second and receive the flawless welcome she had spent weeks preparing. Instead, something unexpected happened. Before a single executive could approach the gangway, one of the uniformed crew members stepped onto the dock, scanned the waiting crowd for only a brief second, then walked directly past every resort executive without slowing down. He continued straight toward Claire. Samuel watched with widening eyes as the crew member stopped a respectful distance away and smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "Mr. Bennett asked me to let you know that his helicopter landed a few minutes ago. He will be aboard in less than 5 minutes." Claire returned the smile with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate it." The crew member gave a courteous nod before returning toward the yacht. Behind him, complete silence settled across the marina. Victoria Hayes remained frozen where she stood. Ryan slowly turned toward Claire, his earlier doubts disappearing completely. In that unforgettable moment, everyone finally realized the quiet woman they had dismissed hours earlier had never been waiting for permission to enter the resort. She had been waiting for someone far more important than anyone standing on that dock. No one moved. The only sound was the gentle splash of seawater against the dock as every executive, employee, and guest struggled to understand what they had just witnessed. Victoria Hayes felt her carefully rehearsed smile slowly disappear. Only moments earlier she had been preparing to welcome one of the most influential investors in the hospitality industry. Now she stood watching members of an elite yacht crew address the woman she had quietly dismissed as if she were one of the most respected people on board. Ryan Cole lowered his eyes for a brief moment, replaying every word spoken in the lobby. Claire had never demanded special treatment. She had never mentioned money, status, or influence. She had simply asked for a place to wait. The realization settled heavily on him. Sometimes kindness required no verification at all. High above the marina, the rhythmic sound of helicopter blades gradually drifted across the coastline. Heads turned instinctively toward the clear blue sky as a sleek helicopter approached from inland before circling once above the harbor. It descended smoothly toward the yacht's private landing platform, its polished exterior gleaming beneath the afternoon sun. Guests along the waterfront lifted their phones once again, convinced they were about to witness the arrival of someone whose name regularly appeared on the front pages of financial magazines. The rotors slowed, the cabin door opened, and Ethan Bennett stepped onto the deck with the relaxed confidence of a man who had long ago stopped being impressed by attention. At 44, he wore a navy sport coat over an open-collar white shirt, dark slacks, and simple leather shoes. There were no bodyguards surrounding him, no dramatic gestures, and no attempt to command the crowd. His eyes searched only for one person. The moment he saw Claire standing near Dock 7, his face softened into a genuine smile that no business achievement had ever been able to produce. Without acknowledging the executives waiting several yards away, Ethan walked calmly down the gangway. Crew members stepped aside respectfully as he crossed the dock with steady, unhurried steps. Claire smiled back, and before anyone could speak, he wrapped her in a warm embrace. It was not a display of wealth or power. It was simply the greeting of a husband who was genuinely happy to see his wife. He kissed her gently on the forehead before taking both of her hands. "I am sorry I kept you waiting," he said quietly. Claire laughed softly. "You only made me enjoy the ocean view a little longer." Ethan noticed the faint disappointment still lingering in her eyes. "Did everything go as planned?" he asked. Claire hesitated for only a second before answering honestly. "Not exactly. I was unable to wait inside the resort." Ethan did not interrupt. He simply listened as Claire briefly described her arrival without exaggeration or bitterness. She never criticized anyone personally. She merely explained that she had been asked to leave because they could not verify her reservation. Ethan remained silent after she finished. His expression never became angry, but those who knew him understood that his quietest moments usually carried the greatest weight. Behind them, Victoria Hayes finally gathered enough courage to step forward. Her confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. Every polished sentence she had practiced throughout the morning suddenly felt meaningless. She realized with growing certainty that the most important first impression of the entire day had already been made, and it had nothing to do with luxury, elegance, or investment presentations. It had everything to do with how her resort had treated a woman whose dignity had never depended on anyone else's opinion. Victoria Hayes stopped only a few feet away from Ethan and Claire, yet the distance felt impossible to cross. The confidence that had carried her through countless meetings with celebrities, executives, and politicians had vanished, replaced by a quiet realization that no amount of polished hospitality could erase what had already happened. She drew a careful breath before speaking. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding this afternoon. We would be honored if you would allow us to welcome you properly." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable disappointment behind his steady eyes. "The welcome was already given," he replied softly. "Unfortunately, it was given before anyone knew who my wife was." The words settled over the marina with remarkable weight. No one attempted to interrupt. Ryan lowered his gaze, while several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan was not raising his voice or embarrassing anyone publicly. That made his words even harder to ignore. Victoria swallowed quietly. "If there is anything we can do to correct our mistake, we are prepared to do it immediately." Claire gently touched Ethan's arm before answering herself. "I appreciate your apology. I truly do. But I never expected special treatment. I only hoped to be treated with ordinary courtesy." Those standing nearby felt the truth of her words immediately. She had never asked for luxury. She had never demanded recognition. She had only wanted a chair while waiting for her husband. Samuel Brooks watched from several yards away and slowly nodded to himself. Throughout his career he had met wealthy people who insisted on privilege before offering respect. Claire had demonstrated the opposite. Her dignity had remained unchanged whether she stood inside a marble lobby or on an old wooden dock. Ethan turned toward the executives once more. "You have spent months preparing for today's meeting," he said. "I imagine you have also prepared presentations, investment proposals, and expansion plans." Victoria nodded carefully. "Yes, we have." Ethan offered a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Then perhaps there is something you should know before we continue." The marina became completely silent again. Even guests standing along the waterfront leaned forward to hear his next words. "My investment team has been evaluating luxury coastal properties across the southeast for nearly a year. Seabrook Cove has consistently ranked near the top of our list. We were prepared to discuss a partnership exceeding $200 million, including environmental restoration, marina expansion, and long-term employee development." Audible gasps spread quietly through the crowd. Ryan looked toward Victoria, whose face had noticeably lost its color. Ethan continued with the same measured tone. "This visit was never intended to evaluate architecture or financial reports. Those documents were already impressive. Today's purpose was much simpler. We wanted to understand the culture of this resort. We wanted to see how people were treated when no one believed they were important." Claire lowered her eyes modestly, almost uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. She had never planned to participate in any kind of test. She had simply arrived early for their anniversary. Ethan glanced toward her with quiet affection before looking back at the management team. "My wife did not know about our evaluation. She was never asked to play a role. She was simply herself. Honest, patient, respectful, and kind. The results we witnessed today were therefore completely genuine." No one spoke. The magnificent resort, with all its elegance and prestige, suddenly felt very small beside one simple truth. Character had revealed itself far more clearly than luxury ever could. For several long seconds, the only movement came from the gentle waves brushing against the dock. The executives who had spent months preparing detailed financial projections now understood that none of those documents mattered as much as a single ordinary interaction that had lasted only a few minutes. Victoria Hayes slowly lowered the folder she had been carrying all afternoon. Every presentation she had memorized suddenly felt meaningless. She looked toward Claire with genuine regret. "Mrs. Bennet," she said quietly, "there is no excuse for how we treated you today. I believed I was protecting the reputation of this resort, but instead I failed to protect the values that should have defined it." Claire met her eyes with the same calm expression she had worn since arriving that morning. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "Acknowledging a mistake is never easy." Ethan remained silent, allowing the conversation to continue naturally. He had learned throughout his career that character revealed itself most clearly after failure, not before it. Ryan Cole stepped forward next. "I owe you an apology as well," he said sincerely. "I should have spoken up when I realized something did not feel right. I allowed procedure to become more important than simple kindness." Claire offered him a small smile. "The fact that you recognize that now matters more than you probably realize." Those words seemed to lift a quiet weight from Ryan's shoulders. Ethan finally spoke again. "Business partnerships are built on trust. Buildings can be renovated. Marinas can be expanded. Luxury suites can always be redesigned. Character is far more difficult to rebuild once it has been neglected." Victoria nodded slowly. She understood every word. "Does that mean our opportunity is over?" she asked with complete honesty. Ethan looked across the waterfront before answering. "That depends on what kind of future you truly want for this place." Confused expressions spread through the management team. Ethan continued in his calm, measured voice. "If I wanted perfection, I would be disappointed today. If I wanted people who never made mistakes, I would spend the rest of my life searching. What matters is whether an organization is willing to learn from those mistakes before they become part of its identity." Hope quietly returned to several faces. Claire gently squeezed Ethan's hand before adding her own thoughts. When I walked into the lobby this morning, I was not hoping anyone would recognize my name. I was hoping they would recognize my humanity. Every guest who enters these doors deserves that, whether they arrive in a limousine, a pickup truck, or on foot. Several employees standing nearby lowered their heads as those words settled deeply in the afternoon air. Samuel Brooks smiled quietly from the edge of the dock. In all his years working along the coast, he had rarely witnessed a lesson delivered with such grace. Ethan reached into his jacket and handed Victoria a simple business card rather than a contract. "My team will contact you next week," he said. "Not to discuss construction budgets first, but to discuss leadership training, guest experience, and organizational culture. If your resort is willing to invest in those things before marble, glass, and luxury amenities, then perhaps today's mistake will become the beginning of something worthwhile rather than the end of an opportunity." Victoria accepted the card carefully, almost as though it carried far greater value than any investment proposal. She understood that what had just been offered was not a reward for success. It was a second chance to become the kind of place where no guest would ever again have to prove their worth before receiving simple respect. 1 year later, Seabrook Cove Resort looked even more beautiful than before, but those who worked there understood that the most important changes could not be seen in polished marble, renovated guest suites, or the expanded marina. They could be felt in every greeting at the front entrance, every conversation at the reception desk, and every decision made when someone walked through the doors without expensive luggage or recognizable status. The first lesson taught to every new employee was no longer about premium services or exclusive amenities. It began with a simple reminder printed beneath the resort's mission statement. Every guest deserves respect before recognition. Those 6 words quietly transformed the culture of the entire property. Victoria Hayes remained the general manager, but she often admitted that the most valuable leadership lesson of her career had arrived wearing faded blue jeans and carrying a canvas tote. Rather than hiding what had happened, she shared the story openly during employee orientation. She explained how assumptions had nearly cost the resort not only a remarkable business opportunity but something even more valuable, the chance to live according to the values it claimed to represent. Ryan Cole eventually became director of guest experience. He introduced a tradition that every employee embraced. Once each week, managers spent time working alongside frontline staff, welcoming guests personally instead of remaining behind office doors. The goal was simple. Remember that hospitality began with people, not appearances. Samuel Brooks continued overseeing the marina, and whenever visitors admired the impressive yachts entering the harbor, he smiled quietly to himself. He had learned that the largest vessel he had ever seen was not the most memorable part of that unforgettable afternoon. The most memorable sight had been watching a woman remain gracious after being treated unfairly. Claire and Ethan Bennett never spoke publicly about what had happened. They accepted the partnership only after the resort completed months of leadership training and community outreach. Together they invested not only in renovations but also in scholarship programs for hospitality students, environmental conservation projects, and employee education. Claire insisted that every dollar devoted to improving the property should also improve the lives of the people working there. On the anniversary of that remarkable day, the resort unveiled a small bronze plaque overlooking Dock 7. It did not mention billionaires, investments, luxury yachts, or business deals. It carried only one sentence. True hospitality begins the moment we choose to see the dignity in every person. Guests often paused to read those words before continuing toward the marina, unaware of the story that inspired them. Yet the message never needed further explanation. Respect did not belong only to those who appeared successful. Kindness did not require proof of wealth. Character revealed itself most clearly when no reward seemed possible. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Atlantic Ocean, Claire and Ethan stood together aboard their yacht, watching the golden light reflect across the calm water. Claire smiled as she looked toward the resort in the distance. "I am glad they were willing to learn," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "So am I. Buildings can become more beautiful with enough investment, but people become better only when they choose humility." The evening breeze carried their words across the quiet harbor before fading into the sound of gentle waves. And on that peaceful shoreline, everyone who had witnessed the events of that extraordinary day remembered something that would remain far more valuable than wealth itself. The greatest measure of a person's character is not how they treat those who seem important. It is how they treat those who appear to have nothing to offer in return.